Hey guys, what is up? Public here back with another video, and we have the first batch of 10.2 changes. So we're going to go over what's changed for Shadow Priest and Priest in general so far in 10.2. And we also have our set bonuses as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of kind of just reading through some of the changes, and then also going to go over how the set bonus works. It's a little wordy and not super intuitive how everything works. So let's dive in. All right, so first things first, let's go over the just kind of patch notes of the changes, starting off with generic priest changes. So first up, this is the doozy. They've nerfed power infusion. They've changed the haste amount was lowered and the duration was lowered. The duration is the one I'm probably more upset with, to be honest with you. So it being 20 seconds was perfect for Dark Ascension, and it being lowered to 15 seconds makes it even worse now for Void Form, which, before all of the changes we'll get into in a second, we were getting easily 40 second plus void forms, right? So it was already only lasting the first bit of it, and now it's going to be even less good for that build. So overall, with our just standard Dark Ascension build, we're losing like 1.5% to 2% overall damage. And then who we're giving PI to, right? Because this also affects the twins power infusion, right? The other person that gets it. Looking at other people, they also lost about 2%. And again, this is just going to, it's not really going to change who we want to give PI to. It's just lowering the value of it. Unfortunately, I don't think Shadow Priest was deserving of like a single target nerf because of this, and there is no compensating change here. So pretty disappointing that this is the way they went about it. They even noted that they made this change because of how it stacks with other specs. Like specs that deal in a short window, like that's not Shadow, right? So yeah, I think there are a couple ways they could have done this differently. The main one is if you nerf Power Infusion baseline, if you then buff the percentage that Twins gives you, that'll kind of balance it out. So it's kind of backwards for what most people think. I even messed this up when I first looked at it, right? So Twins says when you cast it on someone else, you get 100% of those effects on yourself. So what they could do, if they nerf Power Infusion baseline, they just need to buff this percent that is included in Twins to offset that, so that the Priest Power Infusion remains unchanged. Or I think they just need to give us compensating buffs elsewhere. So, yeah, pretty disappointed with this. I think there's much better ways to go about it. And I don't actually think this fixes the problem necessarily. Like the top PI specs are still going to be the top PI specs. Yeah, they lost like 2% of that value of their overall damage, but it's still very strong and still stronger than it was for other specs at the time. So I don't think this is really hitting the mark here. Okay, they've also done some stuff with Shadow or Death. This will make more sense when we get into the tier set, but basically they changed it so Shadow or Death no longer deals a copied percent of the actual damage it does. It's now a fixed damage that you take yourself when you cast Shadow or Death. So by default, it's 8% of your max health when you fail to kill a target and backlash damage to the priest. And then Tithe Evasion reduces that by 50%, so it's 4% max health and damage. And then the other thing too is with that they've also made it so that any damage reduction effects, so this includes things like Fade or Flash Shield DR, things like that, would also reduce the amount of damage that you take as well. Generally speaking, if you don't factor in the new tier set, this is effectively a survivability buff. Like we are taking less damage with this change, like considering how much we're casting Shadow or Death currently. So overall positive, definitely a good thing. I do still think that you need Tithe Evasion if you're playing Inescapable Torment builds. You will notice the damage otherwise. It's not like the damage is zero, but we do kind of counter it enough with Devouring Plague, Vamp Touch Healing, and then Mental Fortitude as well. So interesting change. It'll make more sense why they did this when we get to the tier set. They've also changed Mass Dispel to be a 2-minute cooldown. Which was 45 seconds. I don't think this is crazy, although it is somewhat, disappointing. I think the strength of Mass Dispel historically has just been bursting, and then this season it really just ramped up because of dungeon design. So, depending on the dungeons we go into next season, if Mass Dispel has no big use cases outside of bursting, and there's nothing in the raid that's worth Mass Dispelling, this nerf would have kind of been for nothing. So yeah, I don't think I'm a big fan of this change. I don't know, just feels kind of weird, but I don't know. I think if they design dungeon mechanics in such a way this will be fine. But it's super dependent on how they design those, right? Like, if there are big things that make Mass Dispel feel really good in practice, even with a 2-minute cooldown, then it will be fine. But if a mob is going to sit there and cast a really nasty debuff every 20 seconds, like, having Mass Dispel or not having it won't really matter, because if it's going to do enough damage to kill you, Mass Dispel wouldn't help anyways, right? So, yeah, I mean, just gotta kind of wait and see how this works, but overall, kind of meh. So what they did, they also removed Improved Mass Dispel and made it a PvP talent instead. And they gave us a new talent called Mental Agility that reduces the mana cost of Purify Disease, Mass Dispel, and Dispel Magic. I'm kind of sad that they made, like, this was the talent that they chose. With the recent rework to the mana cost, especially for Shadow Priest, I honestly think the mana costs of all these spells are pretty fair. And I don't actually know if there's a reason to ever take this talent as Shadow specifically. I don't think you're casting enough spells that cost mana to see value out of this, especially if Mass Dispel's cooldown is 2 minutes. So yeah, kind of disappointed with that. I mean, I don't know. We'll see what they want to do. Okay, so as far as class talents go, that's all that is affecting Shadow Priest. So if we go to spec-specific changes, first one up, Shadow Crash damage is now reduced beyond 5 targets. Okay, I read this and I didn't understand what they were doing. Shadow Crash's damage is like nothing. If I just, sit here, okay, let's just cast it here. How much does it do? Okay, it hit for 7,000 damage. That's my Shadow Flame proc did more than that, right? It does like nothing. It's very insignificant damage in the grand scheme. Like, in keys, we're talking about like 1% or 2%, right, from Shadow Crash damage. So I was a little confused on that. Again, that'll make more sense when we go to the tier set. So what this means is, starting at 5 targets, the damage is not flat. It will be square root scaled based on the number of targets. So you're not like linearly scaling that damage up. This is how most AoE spells work in the game now. Shadow Crash was just one of the weird outliers that didn't work like this. Okay, and this is a pretty massive nerf. They changed Surge of Insanity, which is either Mind Flay Insanity or Mind Spike Insanity, to now trigger from every 3 casts of Devouring Plague instead of every cast. They didn't really change anything else about how it stacks, whatever. They noted that the rotation has a lot going on, and much of that is due to the frequency of Mind Flay Insanity and Mind Spike Insanity are available. So we're just adjusting the frequency. I really disagree with this, actually. I don't think the rotation was that busy. I think it was manageable, and I actually think there was like, not skill necessarily, but like that was the whole rotation of the spec right now, especially out of cooldowns, was being able to balance those charges without losing them. And so now you don't have any of that. That mini game is effectively gone. You'll use them when you get them, but it's not going to be, it's considerably less often now. So I don't really understand their reasoning here. And this is actually a massive nerf. They did do some compensating buffs. So Mind Flay Insanity increased by 30%. Mind Spike Insanity increased by 20%. If you do the math, that's a massive nerf. Like they reduced how many that we're getting and then did not buff the proc by enough to compensate with that. So this is close to an 8% nerf on single target, factoring all of this in together. And if you do note, they also only buffed Mind Flay baseline and not Mind Spike. So Mind Flay's damage, like a tick of Flay, now does more than Mind Spike does baseline. I don't know why they're doing that, especially considering Mind Spike costs a talent point. So why is it doing less damage than the thing it's replacing? This feels like a massive oversight, and I just don't understand why Mind Spike is a talent. This does not necessarily mean we're not going to take Mind Spike anymore. We do get that, like, Mind Spike is buffed by Dark Ascension, Mind Flay is not. So if we're taking a Dark Ascension build, there is kind of a disparity there. But obviously, like, tuning around that is really weird. And obviously, like, where does Void Form fit into all this? Yeah, overall, I just massively disagree with this. I don't think Shadow Priest needed the nerf to begin with. And 2, I don't think the rotation was busy enough to warrant this heavy-handed of a change. Especially without compensating enough. Like, if they made this change and then also said, hey, Mind Spike Insanity is now instant cast, or hey, Mind Flay Insanity is now cast while moving, and then hey, we also buffed their damage to compensate that you're getting significantly less of them. So it feels weird that the reasoning is the rotation was busy, but then they nerfed us instead. Like, I don't get the nerf part of it. Like, if that was their true reasoning, then why did they actually end up nerfing the value of it? Like, that's just weird. And I think the tricky part too, which maybe wasn't super clear, nerfing the frequency doesn't mean, okay, well, you just need to buff it by enough because now we're casting significantly less. It's also all the interactions with them as well, right? Like, now you can't fit in as many Mind Spike Insanity casts inside your Dark Ascension window. So, like, I think 3 was just way too much. I just completely disagree with this change. Not quite sure what they're doing. Okay, so that's all the changes to, like, the base spec and everything. I have a feedback doc that I'm currently working on. I'll be posting it to the forums sometime this weekend, just to get all my initial thoughts out there after playing with it for a little bit and just kind of talking to the community. Let me know what you think about all these changes. If I'm off base on anything, if I missed anything, let me know what your thoughts are. I'm pretty disappointed with them in general. I'm happy they provided reasoning here, but I think the reasoning doesn't quite make sense. So I think that'll give us some hopefully a dialogue to start with them of like, hey, you said this was your reasoning. I don't quite agree with it. Let's talk about it. So we'll see where they want to go from there. Okay, so now let's talk about the set bonus. So with all of those changes in mind, they did change, or not change, but they released our set bonuses as well. Actually, I don't even know if it's on this post. Let's see. No, it doesn't look like it. Okay, so you can see my tooltips here, though. It's kind of tiny. Okay, so the 2 set is Shadow Word Death, triggers 2 additional times at 50% effectiveness. So let's just talk about that first. So this means if I'm just sitting here and I press Shadow Word Death, it triggers 2 additional times. Right, so you can see the first one hit, I don't know, it's kind of hard to read, but the first one hit for 8,000 and the next 2 hit for 4,000. And then I also, you still get the damage taken event as well. So that's the first part of the 2-piece, right? Every Shadow Word Death you press is now duplicated. It's currently set to duplicate twice by default. Now, we'll get into all the interactions in a second, but that's, you can kind of think of that in your head. That's the base 2-piece. And then on top of that, the 2-piece also says it triggers an additional time at 50% effectiveness if Death Speaker is active or your target is below 20% health. So unfortunately, this is currently bugged, and I'll see if I can get a Death Speaker proc while I'm talking. When you have a Death Speaker proc, you don't get that extra cast. It does work in Execute. These dummies aren't in Execute. I just went here because it's quieter, but in the big dummies that everyone is hitting, it would actually duplicate a 3rd time. So in total, 1 cast of Shadow Word Death would actually get you 4 hits of the spell if you have Death Speaker up or if the target is in Execute. Now, what's really cool about this, and hopefully I can get a proc at some point here. I'll try to proc. Okay, so we have a Death Speaker proc. So when I use this, the very cool thing about this, and we'll start getting into the interactions, you can see the first one hit for 45,000, and then the next 2 duplicated for 22 and 23,000. So it is actually snapshotting the state of that original Shadow Word Death for Death Speaker's bonus specifically. Meaning the echoed versions of the Execute or Death Speaker one also get buffed by Death Speaker. So it's not just that initial one that gets buffed by Death Speaker, it's all the echoes that Shadow Word Death would produce as well, all of those chain casts. Which is kind of crazy, right? That's how that works. So I've went ahead and I've been like documenting how all of this stuff works, so let's kind of go over that. If I remember, I'll put a link to this. This is just in the SimC wiki. So there's a lot of questions like what works with the 2-piece before we even get to the 4 set, which is actually simpler. Okay, so right now, extra chain from the 2-piece is not working with Death Speaker. It does work in Execute. And then, like I said, does not snapshot multipliers except for Death Speaker. So what I mean by that is, if you noticed, it's a little hard to see in here, but the actual chain Shadow Word Deaths don't happen instantly. There is actually a slight delay there. So, and it's roughly like, it depends on like the server tick. I've seen it anywhere between like 100 milliseconds and 300 milliseconds between each echo. So from the initial one, 200 milliseconds later, first echo, 200 milliseconds later from that one, the last echo or whatever else it is. What that means is you could actually get lucky or unlucky, right? If you proc something or remove a modifier in between those echoes, that does affect the state of it, right? So in the example, the easiest one to understand is like, if let's say you have Dark Ascension active and you press a Shadow or Death right as Dark Ascension is ending, well, whatever Shadow or Deaths happen after Dark Ascension expires, you lose that modifier, right? So it's not actually snapshotting all of those states. It is updating dynamically, except for Death Speaker. The Death Speaker modifier always carries over. Death and Madness works pretty much how you expect it to work. So you only get that free reset of Death and Madness when you're hard casting it. So otherwise the talent would almost do nothing. And then the actual debuff that checks whether or not the target has died within, I think, 7 seconds or whatever, does get refreshed every echo as well. So more or less works exactly how you want, which is great. So Death Speaker is only consumed by main Shadow or Death casts. So if you happen, and I tested this, it's hard to get it tested, but if you happen to get a Death Speaker proc in the middle of the Shadow or Death echoes happening, it's not consumed. It is only consumed whenever you yourself press Shadow or Death, which is important. We already talked about the damage. Other interesting point, all casts of Shadow or Death get the Insanity. So if you see my Insanities at 0 here, I press it 4, 8, 12. You can see how it ticked up there. So every echo is giving you Insanity. This is effectively just tripling Shadow or Death's Insanity, or quadrupling an Execute. Inescapable Torment. So if we have Mindbender active and we press Shadow or Death, guess what? You get 3 Mindbender hits for an Inescapable Torment. It chains just as you would expect it will. That also means Mindbender is significantly extended. Every single time I cast Shadow or Death, it gets extended. So that works as you would expect. Psychic Link. This is the one I'm pretty sure is a bug, because most things are working as you would expect. Unfortunately for Psychic Link, only the original Shadow or Death is currently triggering Psychic Link damage. So the echoed casts of Shadow or Death are not counting towards Psychic Link and are not triggering it. Again, pretty sure this is a bug. I don't understand why this wouldn't work, but all this other stuff does. Hopefully it gets fixed soon. Making a bug report after this video. And then self-damage, like I mentioned, all casts will trigger the self-damage event. So when I hit this, right, I got 3 hits of damage, and then I got 3 hits of damage to myself. Now, this is important because they did change how Shadow or Death self-damage works. So it does mean in this case, even though this was an unbuffed Shadow or Death, right? So I hit the target for 8,900 damage. The first one hit me for 22,000 damage. It is kind of funny that it deals more damage than that, but that's just how the modifiers work. It's funny. What is interesting about this, and I don't know exactly why it's working this way, but the echoed Shadow or Death, so this one hit for these guys hit for 4.4, 4.5 thousand. Those do 90% reduced damage taken to you on the backlash. So for whatever reason, instead of them hitting for full, they only hit for 90% reduced. Probably a good thing. Without that, we'd be severely chunking ourselves with this. So yeah, I think it's just kind of a hidden way that it works. So, okay, that's the 2-piece. There's a lot going on there. If you have questions, throw them in the comments. Still kind of figuring it out, but that's our 2-piece. Kind of wild. So the 4-piece is where things kind of come full circle a little bit with what we were talking about earlier. Every time you take damage from Shadow or Death, gain a stack of Death's Torment, increasing the initial damage of the next cast for your Shadow or Pain by 250%, or increasing the damage of your next Shadow Crash by 50%. And this stacks up to 12 times. This is quite ridiculous. The important thing to note here is that it's increasing the damage of Shadow or Pain's initial hit. Right, the direct damage, it has nothing to do with the ticks of that, right? Same thing with Shadow Crash, it's just that initial damage. Why that's important is because all of these multipliers are stacking together. This works with Dark Ascension. So, oops, I didn't mean. So as I press Shadow or Death, you see I get stacks of Death's Torment. It's a minute-long buff, so it's pretty hard to waste this guy. and all of the echoes, since they are also hitting us, contribute to this, right? So when we press that, right, we're still getting stacks of all of it. Now, this leads to very, very, very large hits of Shadow Word Pain. So this does mean Shadow Word Pain is now being added into our rotation, at least in single target, depending on if you have Shadow Crash or not, just because the modifier gets so huge. So now, to note, you get stacks when Shadow Word Death hits you. This is also on a little bit of a delay. It's about 1 second. So every time you press Shadow Crash, it hits the mob. 1 second later, it hits you. Then you get a stack. So it's kind of important. You won't, you can't press Shadow Word Death and then discharge all stacks immediately. There has to be a delay there. Okay, I have 12 stacks. Shadow Word Pain, boom, 85,000 damage. Just from one cast of Shadow Word Pain, 85,000 damage. And that's not being buffed by anything. That can also crit. It gets buffed by Dark Ascension, like I mentioned. Pretty wild. And the same thing works for Shadow Crash, which is why they added the square root scaling on Shadow Crash's damage. So that is our set bonus. We're still kind of testing a lot of it. Again, just kind of making sure we understand fully how it's even working, but that is our set bonus. It's definitely going to lead to a couple things to note. One of them being it's highly indexing us into Dark Ascension, Shadow Word Death, and Mindbender builds, which is the kind of de facto build I've been suggesting for raiding anyways. This is effectively triple downing on that. Like, this is going to be the go-to build almost certainly. And then the kind of question here is, because of that, how is Void Form affected? All of this is significantly favoring Dark Ascension over Void Form. It's very possible that Void Form kind of gets put to the wayside. The question, I think, is more on like keys specifically. I think that's where maybe Void Form could still make sense. But Dark Ascension is just going to do a lot more in terms of buffing all of these modifiers that we're now getting on Shadow Word Pain, Shadow Word Death. That playstyle works very well with the tier set. So it's highly likely Void Form is going to take a back seat this tier if nothing changes. So, and the other thing as well, we're still not sure, like, with this change to Shadow Crash, how does that specifically affect our talents? Obviously, you would think you would just press Shadow Word Pain single target, Shadow Crash and AoE. We're going to have to see how the numbers work out, because Shadow Crash does give you that extra benefit of, well, when you throw a Shadow Crash, it also refreshes your dots, which saves you a cast down the road of Vampiric Touch. So yeah, something to think about. One small note, I forgot to mention this with the 4-set. You do not proc the 4-set consumption with Misery. So if you have the buff active, you press Vampiric Touch, does not consume it, right? You have to hard cast Shadow Word Pain. So if anyone is unbounded Shadow Word Pain, add it back. So yeah, so this is so far what we have in 10.2. There's a couple other new items and trinkets to go over and all that kind of stuff, but I kind of just wanted to cover the class changes for now, and then we'll see what changes or not. And like I said, forum posts will be in the description below, so if you agree with me, disagree, whatever, leave your comments in there. Just remember to be respectful, and hopefully we'll see what other changes are in store for the spec. Thanks for watching. See ya.